Thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Marilyn Mobley, Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Power of Diversity lecture series. Dr. Damon Williams. He is a visionary and inspirational leader and also one of the nation's recognized experts in strategic diversity leadership, youth development, corporate responsibility and educational achievement, social impact, and organizational change. Personally, I met him at the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and I knew from the first time I met him that at some point I was going to get him to our campus. So today is your day. I hope you're happy. He is a global thought leader, having worked with more than 1,000 colleges and universities. I actually think that number is low. Fortune 100 companies, foundations, and government agencies, as a keynote speaker, as a strategist, as an educator, and a social impact leader. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan Center for the Study of Higher Education and Post-Secondary Education, where he specialized in the areas of organizational behavior and management. He received his master's degree in educational leadership and his bachelor's in sociology and Black World Studies, both from Miami University. As the University of Michigan celebrates her 200th anniversary, he was recently awarded the Bicentennial Leadership Award, a one-time honor given to 20 trailblazing alumni who exemplify the best of academic leadership and values in the United States. He also has He is also the 2017 recipient of the Western Reserve Academy Waring Prize, the highest alumni award presented by the prestigious boarding school in 1826 to recognize exceptional leadership achievements to improve the human condition. He let me know that he's not a stranger to Ohio because of his time at the Western Reserve Academy. In 2013, he was awarded the coveted Inclusive Excellence Award of Leadership from the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and as a leadership commendation from the 13 research institutions comprising the Committee on Institutional Cooperation for his landmark contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusive strategy globally. As Associate Vice Chancellor, Vice Provost, and Chief Diversity Officer, he founded the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and served as a senior leader building the Division of Multicultural and International Affairs at the University of Connecticut, respectively. As a scholar in residence for the American Council on Education Fellows Program and the American Association of Colleges and Universities Greater Expectations Institute, he launched his work nationally, helping hundreds of colleges and universities to transform their efforts to liberal education, STEM completion, improving student graduation rates, campus climate and inclusion, leadership development, faculty diversity, and curriculum reform. For all of these reasons, I wanted to bring my friend to campus today, and so I'm happy to introduce you and hope that you will help me give a warm welcome to Damon Williams. Dr. Damon Williams. Okay.
It's great to be here with you. And the thing I'll say is I'm always happy when I'm back in the Buckeye State. Because I was born in Springfield, raised in Dayton, went to boarding school at Western Reserve Academy up in Northeast Ohio, undergrad at Miami University, married in Cincinnati, and then, and only then, was I allowed to lead the state. So I am an Ohioan. I am a Michigan man, bred by breeding, but I was born an Ohioan and a Buckeye. And it's always great for me to be home and to be in the state of Ohio, and particularly to have an opportunity to be in this auspicious community at the invitation of such wonderful leaders who have done so much. I've never been to Case Western before. And this is my first visit to campus, and have had a series of robust discussions with your leadership through today, and hope to ultimately have a discussion with you as I move into this lecture, which is titled From Awareness to Action to Innovation, Empowering Leaders Through Inclusive Excellence. Now, I am at DAW PhD. For those of you who want to continue the conversation in the social media sphere, and I am hashtagging. I am always hashtagging strategic diversity leadership and inclusive excellence. So again, I am at DAWPhD, and I am hashtagging strategic diversity leadership and inclusive excellence. And the thing that I will say is as follows. For anyone who has a particularly compelling capturing of an idea or a concept that's offered here today, they meme a movement of mine, or they do anything that is going to absolutely incite engagement in the social media sphere, my team goes back and looks at all the posts, and you can be the recipient of a signed copy of Strategic Diversity Leadership or the Chief Diversity Officer for your reading enjoyment and the completion of your leadership library. Because no library will be complete without these two key contributions to the discussion. So let's get after it. At DAWPhD, hashtagging inclusive excellence and hashtagging strategic diversity leadership. Now, I've had the good fortune to be the student leader who grew up. I was just down the road at Miami University, engaged in student activism when that institution was struggling with the naming motif of the institution as the Miami University Redskins. And my first engagement with this idea of changing organizations intentionally to be more inclusive came through the work that we were doing as student leaders around representations and symbols and ideas, because symbols and ideas have meaning and value and impact and create ripple effects of exclusion and inclusion in our environment. And my first engagement with those ideas happened at Miami University as an undergraduate student. I was a student that stood up and told the president, "You're not committed." I told the provost, "I don't know why you think this should stand, but we've got to make a change today." I was a student that stood on principle. I was the student that took over buildings. I was a student that spoke truth to power. And needless to say, as the administrator, I paid for all of it dearly. Because not too terribly long from then, I was on the other side of the equation. I'm the student leader who grew up. I'm the student activist who grew up, but yet continues to live their life each and every day, wanting to empower those who are on the margin, wanting to find ways to empower leaders to create ripples of change in our organization, want to find ways to take the power and the privilege that I have and to give it up to allow for those to be a part of a greater possibility. That's who I am, and that's who I have been. And through my career, I've had a chance to work with so many organizations, college, universities, not-for-profit organizations, corporations, and most recently during the last 4 years, working at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, working to create new pathways for students across all spectra of identity to go on to what we refer to as great futures. And inside of this work, what I'm seeing more and more today is that there's this persistence that we're seeing where there's a tremendous amount of action. There's a tremendous amount of awareness, but I don't know if we're seeing nearly as much innovation as we need to get to where we need to go. Because see, this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is never a project of remaining where we are. It's never a project of simply talking about the campus climate data that we collected but doing nothing with it. It's never a project of simply looking at the performance differentials that we see in 6-year graduation rates, 4-year graduation rates, or maybe retention and engagement in certain fields of study for those of different backgrounds. It's never a conversation of simply talking about exclusion and not doing anything to create more inclusive possibilities. See, diversity, equity, and inclusion is always a project that's about from to. And what I found to be the delta from to, the delta that exists that we must overcome, is not just being aware, not just doing stuff. What we've got to do is we've got to become more innovative. Now, in my work at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, I led nearly a $250 million portfolio and had the opportunity to work with some of the most amazing leaders across the country trying to innovate possibilities for the next generation of young people who will be the next generation of leaders in this country, what I refer to as the Centennial generation. The generation coming behind millennials, the generation born mid to late 1990s through to today, the generation that's not just digital native, they're digital intuitive, engaging 9 hours a day. The most diverse generation in the history of our country, not just in terms of race, ethnicity, but also the most diverse in terms of religion, nationality, and sexuality. Indeed, the first group of out LGBTQ teens in the history of our country. moving forward, and I had the opportunity to work with them. And one of the projects that we worked on was a digital innovation project. So trying to create the first 24/7, 365, always on digital club environment. So I spent a tremendous amount of time working with leaders in Silicon Valley. I spent a tremendous amount of time working with leaders that worked at Microsoft. A tremendous amount of time of leaders that worked at NBC, Comcast, NBC Universal, lots of different spaces around this idea of how do we create this digital space, this digital environment. And I nested into this idea of a self-directed learning plan. And one of the first recommendations I would give to each and every one of us here is to be a true leader that's really sparking change. You must be a self-directed, continuous learner. Because it's not what we do trying to create that learning environment for our students, but we have to practice it every day. We have to be looking to level up every day. My dear colleague, Dr. Beverly Tatum, said to me in a conversation this summer, she said, this work is about the ABCs. It's about how we affirm identity, it's how we build community, and it's about how we cultivate leaders. See, the space that we're crafting out for ourselves today, the space that is carved out in the Diversity 360 program, is about carving out spaces for us to level up as leaders, to level up in our ability to innovate, to engage this changed world. And so one of the frameworks, one of the concepts that I've been sharing everywhere I can go is this idea of what makes an innovator an innovator. Now, there's a wonderful book that was authored by Dyer, Greger, and Christensen, the Harvard University Business School faculty, who asked a very simple question, what makes an innovator an innovator? And they went out and they asked this question across many different sectors. Students in the room, the thing I will say is that the most powerful and compelling research oftentimes doesn't have to involve the most powerful and intrusive statistics. The most powerful and compelling research oftentimes begins with the most clear and insightful questions. Right? And so as they went out and talked to innovators across sectors, they talked to innovators in higher ed. They talked to innovators in K through 12. They talked to innovators in the social sector. They talked to innovators in big box retail. They talked to entrepreneurs. They talked to technologists. They talked to innovators. They said they talked to innovators in government, but I don't believe them because I don't think there's no innovation happening there. But I'm going to take them at their word. They talked to innovators across sectors. And what they found is that innovators shared in common several key themes that are so important. One is they said that innovators are always questioning their world. So as a group of the community that's here today, if you're questioning your world and you're asking, why not? What can we do? How do we move beyond the problem? What are the key action steps that we need to put in place? Then chances are you're on a pathway to being an innovator. The second characteristic is innovators don't say simply, oh, there's these institutions that we compare ourselves to as Case Western Reserve University. We compare ourselves to this one and this one and this one. We aspire to be like that one. See, innovators don't allow themselves to be boxed in to any convention. Innovators want to search out a solution wherever they can find them. And once innovators find a solution that is seeming to get some traction, then they want to reapply it. One of the things that Procter & Gamble talks about quite a bit, particularly as it relates to developing their marketing strategies, and Procter & Gamble is the world's leading brand manager, they talk about searching and reapplying strategies. So if you see something work over here, you want to pull it over there. The third characteristic of innovators, though, is that innovators know that innovation oftentimes doesn't happen in silos. Innovation happens at the intersection of groups coming together. It's academic and student affairs. It's individuals who are passionate about race coming together with those who are passionate about gender. It's individuals coming together in a conversation who perhaps feel abstracted from that conversation because oftentimes we don't think about white males as full partners in the work that has to be done. See, intersectionality is important not just in terms of identity, but intersectionality is important towards thought partnership and collaboration. And that's the space that we oftentimes see the greatest outcomes. It's the reason Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs, when Steve Jobs was expelled from Apple, he thought about very quickly leaving the valley. But he knew if he left the valley, he may never go to the level at which he thought he could go to inside of his work because he needed to remain in an innovation hotspot. And so the challenge for us in terms of diversity and inclusion is how do we create innovation hotspots? Where it's not just the diversity champions and the committed members of the choir, but those who are not in that choir that we have to get into that conversation to be able to find new possibilities. But then there's this fourth characteristic of innovators. The fourth characteristic of innovators is that innovators they don't just do this. They have a bias towards action. They start, they do, they launch, they experiment. See, one of the things that's beautiful about the Academy is the Academy actually has a culture of innovation. You think about it. When you're a scholar and you write your first draft of your paper and you get it polished up just a bit, what do? You send it to a conference to get it presented at the conference such that you're able to interact with your marketplace at that conference to get them to wrestle and test the ideas to push it to a higher level. What we've got to do is we've got to do more experimentation of initiatives and actions and things that cut against the grain to see what we can do to create more inclusive possibilities, what we can do to accelerate faculty diversity, what we can do to accelerate completion of degrees in STEM. It's about taking actions that ultimately lead to new outcomes. How many times have you seen there be some data that's collected and we come together in the conversation, we spend all our time talking about the data. The data, 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 the data. We spend so much time talking about the data such that the data becomes the outcome versus the data being the input to the conversation, and we need to be flipping that. 20% conversation about what the data said or did not say, about the methodology and other things, 80% of the time about what we're gonna do differently. How can we break cycles? How can we move in different directions? That's the key to innovation. And see, the idea is that once you figure out something that's working, that fifth characteristic comes in, and that fifth characteristic is we're gonna scale up. We're going to go big. We're not going to allow for ourselves to be limited and to be mired in simply where we are. But once we figure out what works, we want to go big. Now, there was a sixth characteristic of innovation that was also identified as essentially important inside of this work. Can I get some love for that? I just want to make sure y'all still with me. I just want to make sure you are still with me. This sixth characteristic of innovation, which becomes so important and so powerful, is this idea of leading with courage. Because what I found is that inside of diversity, equity, and inclusion related work, if there's no courage, then there is no change. And inside of my books on diversity strategy, I talk about scorecards, and I talk about diversity plans, and I talk about accountability systems, and I talk about incentive systems, and I talk about building the case and understanding the argument. But what I found is the rate limiting factor against all of it is courage. It's individuals, whether they're students who are willing to stand up and to assert their voice and to be accounted for as activists, or it's department chairs who are willing to challenge inside of being first amongst equals in their departments to say, we got to look at this a little bit differently. It's presidents and provosts, but it's also rank and file leaders, faculty in classrooms saying, you know what? I think there might be a different way to get to my learning goals and objectives that can be more inclusive. That can involve maybe creating randomized groups and not having students just to come in and choose groups, because we know we bring students together in diverse groups and it's a safe environment and there's a learning goal and objective, and we're activating that in discussion and dialogue, we can get to better outcomes. It's individuals saying, hey, I'm bringing into this environment a sense of my identity as a male, my identity as an African American, my identity as someone who's heterosexual, and I need to understand what those identity politics mean when I show up in certain types of spaces. When I first showed up at the University of Wisconsin in Madison as Vice Provost Associate Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement, that is a huge title, everybody thought that I was simply going to be the diversity officer for Black folks. Because oftentimes you see an identity, and what you see in that identity can't mean that that individual is able to have empathy and connection and see possibilities of other groups who are on a spectrum of engagement with these issues. Whether that be in terms of gender and women represented at all levels of leadership or in STEM, that means individuals who are part of the LGBTQIA community trying to carve out spaces where their full humanity can be recognized, or that means we're talking about Pell Grant eligibility and moving more people into our institution across all race ethnicities, or it means having tremendous ability to be empathetic to the horror that just happened in Pittsburgh with the synagogue and the shootings that happened. How do we elevate this, and how do we elevate a greater understanding of empathy across the board? See, my career has been powered by these burning questions. What does it mean in the 21st century to be engaged with this conversation of diversity in what we define not as a agrarian economy, not as a industrial economy, not even as a knowledge economy, but what we refer to now more and more as a connection economy. Let's do a little activity here. Give me your hands if you've ever taken an Uber. Connection economy. Give me your hands if you ever ordered something from Amazon.com. Connection economy. Give me your hands if you ever ordered an Airbnb. Connection economy. Give me your hands if you've ever globally sourced talent to work with you on a project from a platform like Odesk.com or Fiverr.com or Upwork.com. See, because in the 21st century world that we find ourselves, any individual who has a high-speed connection can build their brand and launch it in that environment. My decks, my graphic design, the logos that you see, most of them were created by designers in other parts of the world. My graphic designers in Pakistan, my animators in India. I just got back from Dublin where I was lecturing last week, and I had a wonderful round of beers at this wonderful Irish pub with a woman who edits for me, who I met when she was in South Africa. She was back home in Dublin. The connection economy. Economy that is powered by these connectivity, not just for economic possibility, but also an economy that is powered by connectivity that means we live in a world of no secrets. We also live in a world that is becoming deeper and deeper, more tribalized in so many different ways. Because oftentimes when we go into that digital space, we go to those places that we're passionate about. See, I spent a lot of time studying the Centennial generation. We did hundreds of hours of focus group with teams all across this country of various different race, ethnicities, backgrounds, religions, various different backgrounds and identities. And they talked about what technology and technology engagement meant in many ways. In many ways, the Centennials talked about this idea of being in the digital environment means you never had to be alone. You're always connected. It also means that you are always able to pursue your interest levels and your passions. If you want to connect as educators with this generation of students, the first thing you need to do is start talking about your passions and how to find passion. Because when you're constantly navigating the internet, constantly pursuing in a self-directed way what you're interested in, what you mean is you're constantly trying to figure out your passions. Key reason why they're interested in understanding how passion connects to economic opportunity, connects to pathways to the workforce. Key in so many ways. But it also means in many ways that we're not having dialogue. We're not having engagement. And that across our culture, we're continually devolving ourselves away from a democratic praxis of engagement and discourse and moving into hawks and doves, reds and blues, R's and D's, this and that. Think about what we see on CNBC and CNN and Fox every day and television shows, sports shows like First Take. What we see is a context in our broader sociological environment of debate, 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 debate. But what we know is leadership is very rarely about debate. Leadership is about dialogue. And yet our leaders, our students, our emerging leaders come into our environment and they don't know how to dialogue. They don't know how to dialogue. One of the areas I've been constantly pushing in terms of an evidence-based approach to engaging in this work is the critical importance of intergroup dialogues. See, because the intergroup dialogue program and methodology talks about the most fundamental thing that we have to help people to understand how to do is how to engage in the business of dialogue, how to actively listen, how to exchange without domination, how to be able to quiet your voice to be a part of a conversation, to challenge in pointed ways, but yet being able to be willing to be challenged. See, I was that student leader early on and in the early part of my career who saw myself as a warrior inside of the work. I wanted to do damage and intellectual harm to anybody who challenged the concepts of social justice and equity and inclusion. I was a social justice warrior's warrior, I'm telling you. I was that person. And as I continued forward with my career, what I realized is it wasn't about dominating a conversation and winning. What it's about was connecting at a higher level and establishing rapport. What it's about was not trying to win the discussion, but trying to win the war towards inclusion, to greater possibilities of engagement. And the only way we do that is not through a pathway of this, it's a pathway of this. It's understanding the need to continue to engage at the highest levels with a warrior's heart, but doing it with a lover's intention of creating connection. And these burning questions have driven me. How do we create this broad agenda of diversity and inclusion without losing sight of the unique realities and the unique group needs that still are so important for us to have? See, what's happening is we're using these broader and broader strokes around diversity and inclusion. And I believe in creating the big tent, but I also believe in the need for us to have specific and focused conversations that talk about maybe the crisis level conditions that we see around males of color in this country. An entire generation being lost. You see it as you're looking upstream, that we have to have targeted conversations that really focus into what we see as still a persisting lack of full participation in STEM for certain communities. How we create these broader conversations of inclusion across the board. So how do we create the big tent and at the same time create the need for these focused conversations? And that comes back to, again, this idea of affirming identity, building community, cultivating leaders, closing empathy gaps as we become more connected. What does it mean to lead strategically on these issues? Not just to do stuff, but to be evidence-informed in the design of what we do, to be evidence-informed in how we make decisions. So often I visit different places and folks are just doing stuff. And I'm like, well, where did you learn it? Well, we did it like this at my previous institution. But did you ever stop to think that there's a mountain of scholarship that has emerged over the last 2 and 3 decades, which may point the direction towards a more evidence-informed approach to it, to move more strategically? How do we embrace the realities of that Centennial generation that I talked about before and now ready our institutions to become more inclusive now and into the future? What do we do in that regard? And this is one of my favorites. Why is there so much talk of change, but oftentimes seemingly so few results? See, one of my dear colleagues, and dare I say a peer mentor, Professor Cliff Conrad at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he used to talk about these burning questions. And I'm a believer that all of us have to have an understanding of our burning questions. How many of you are familiar with the work of Simon Sinek? Simon Sinek, spelled S-I-N-E-K. He has emerged as a very powerful and influential voice in the connection economy with millions of followers ascribed to his various YouTube channels. And he wrote this compelling book titled The Golden Circle. And inside this book, The Golden Circle, one of the things he said is that leaders who really tip the world, organizations that really tip the world, they don't begin the conversation with what they're going to do. They don't begin the conversation with how they're going to do it. They begin the conversation with a compelling sense of their why. A compelling sense of their why. And so when I do leadership development coaching, when I teach my leadership academy during the summers, when I work with different leaders, one of the things I want to help folks to get more in touch with is, what's their why? What's your why personally, but also too, what's your why strategically? In terms of a changing and shifting environment that is changing and evolving the frame of diversity in the 21st century. One of the things that I talk about in my work is this idea of a perfect storm of factors that are elevating this conversation as never before. There was a time where we could ignore issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can't ignore it. Good, bad, or indifferent in the world we live in today. Have you ever seen more of a time where these issues were elevated consistently, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year? Whether we're talking about it in terms of the horror of what we just saw with the synagogue, whether we're talking about it in terms of the horror of what happened at that event down in Orlando with the LGBTQIA community, or you're talking about the brutalizing of black bodies on streets by law enforcement agents each and every day, or the Me Too movement, which is sending ripple effects across every dimension of organizational life, shaking the foundations of Hollywood all the way to DC. Have you ever seen a space or a time where it was this much ever present? And see, what sits at the center and at the core is the technology and the social media. It's the connectivity. It's not that these are new instances. It's that now everything that happens becomes subject to the connection economy, which means it becomes elevated. And in it becoming elevated means there's more energy in it. And I believe that there's an incredible opportunity for us to look for ways to harness this energy towards the good, even when it may be the horrific. And it's not just that, but it's also the rise of the millennial and the centennial generations. the most diverse generations, as I said before. I was at Boys and Girls Clubs of America. And at the national headquarters, we work with clubs in the Pacific, we work with clubs in the East, we work with clubs international, we work with clubs in the South, we work with clubs in the Midwest. And one of the dynamics that started to emerge in about 2014, 2015, was more and more young people showing up at the clubs who were self-identifying and expressing themselves as part of the LGBTQIA community. Teens and preteens showing up. We get phone calls from the Pacific. The clubs in California be like, national headquarters, we've got a number of students who are showing up asking for this, this, and this. They're saying their name is Jane by birth, but they want to be identified as John. They're asking about restroom facilities. They're asking about lots of different things. This is what we're going to do. Wanted you to know. We get phone calls from the East Coast. East Coast clubs say, hey, students are showing up. They're showing up in the clubs. We're trying to figure out how to be responsive, how to be inclusive. This is what we're thinking about it. National headquarters, what do you think? Clubs in the Midwest phone in. Students are showing up here. We're trying to figure it out. National headquarters tell us what to do. Students in the young people showing up in the South at the clubs. Clubs from the South show up. Students are showing up and they want to do all these strange things, and we told them they couldn't come inside. Regional dynamics that we see playing themselves out. Oftentimes connecting to this broader sociological context that we see around R's and D's, conservatives and progressives, all these things playing out, shaping the realities that we have to lead within when we're in Midwestern institutions. When we're in Southeastern institutions, when you're in Pacific institutions. Similarities, no doubt, across the board, but also some key difference that we have to be teed into. A resurgence of activism, the emergence of a global knowledge economy, persistent societal and educational inequities stratified along the dimensions of race, stratified along the dimensions of ethnicity, stratifying along the dimensions of gender. We see those things playing themselves out over and over and over and over again. The educational and business cases for diversity have now fully transplanted a social justice argument for diversity if we're talking about it at the strategic level, not at the ideological, philosophical level. No one's talking about this as the moral or socially just thing to do. Everybody's talking about it in terms of an educational case or a business case for diversity. Whether you're working in higher education, you're working in the not-for-profit sector. Right now, I'm working with the Brooklyn Nets, American Airlines, FedEx, Teach for America, South Carolina, and every college and university in the free world that's within the sound of my voice. And everybody is engaging with these issues, including the K-12 environment, trying to figure it out. A perfect storm moment that has elevated it, but also, too, a powerful hurricane gale level force that I refer to as Trump-lash, that has sent ripple effects today and each and every day, transforming the broader conversation of what's happening in our nation in ways that we've never seen before. President Trump's leadership is significant in so many ways. One of the ways in which that leadership, and that's saying it very tactfully, one of the ways that that leadership is significant is he is the first 21st century president to lead digitally. President Obama ran for office digitally. President Trump governs digitally. And so there's a persistence to the weight of his role, a persistence to the narrative of his exclusionary politics and dynamics, and is sending incredible ripple effects, not only in terms of appointments of a Kavanaugh, which signals possibilities that are incredibly damning in terms of race-conscious policy, internationalization and nationality, women and the ability to make choices about their body. All those things potentially hang in balance of any decision that's at a 4-3 margin as we peer into the future and look at possibilities. Whether those possibilities that are working their way through the ranks with the Harvard admissions cases or the shots that are being fired right now at Yale and at Brown that signal the same things. In this 21st century new narrative where we're not just constructing narratives of reverse discrimination around white women being the victims, but now it's Asians who are now the new narrative of the new victim. You flash back 15 years ago, all the test cases that were being floated were white women. You look at the current day, it's all Asian community members. Signaling these potential policy shifts and changes. I was at the University of Wisconsin. I stepped away from that and went to work in the corporate sector at Boys and Girls Clubs of America. As there were shifts that were happening, I knew it was time to look at new possibilities and figure out what I was going to do next with my career. I stepped away from what I was doing at that amazing organization, which is BGCA, and I didn't know where I was going to go and what I was going to do next. And I sat back and I saw the horror of what happened at the University of Virginia last academic year. And I can see by the shaking of heads the same horror that you felt, and I had tears in my eyes. And my wife and I were sitting there and we were watching it, and I just said to myself, I feel so helpless right now. I feel as if the work is slipping in the wrong direction right now. I feel as if we're losing this battle. That's what I felt like. And I'm a person that classically believes in action. I didn't know what I could do, but I said, I'm gonna host a webinar. I said, because I bet if I'm feeling some kind of way, there's a whole bunch of other people that are feeling some kind of way, and I'm gonna try to step into some of this void, and I'm gonna try to see what type of conversation I can help to create. We went forward, and 4 weeks later, we had several thousand people join us on our first webinar. We had our second webinar, January 31st. We had 1,300 people register. And then when we did the post-event polling, we realized we touched over 10,000 leaders across the country. The title of that second webinar was Diversity Plans Can't Breathe Without Air. Accountability, incentives, infrastructure, and resources. And it sent ripple effects because people were trying to find signal in the midst of all the noise. Signal in the midst of all the noise. Signal in the midst of all the noise. And so we went out and we started this Inclusive Excellence Tour, and we've been moving around the country, and I'm very thankful, Case Western Reserve University, for y'all allowing me to bring my work and my perspective to be with you today. Thank you for allowing for that. Hate crimes in our country at an all-time high. Ever since 2016, those numbers going up and up and up as tracked by the Southern Poverty Law Center. As in their 2016 data, 917 active hate groups. Their 2017 data up, their 2018 data up from there. Data been going up since the elections season that led to the election of President Trump. That preseason all the way to now have been trending upwards. And so one of the things we did is we went out and we engaged in about 100 interviews with leaders across all of higher education at multiple different levels to really get our hands around some of the themes that people were seeing and engaging and feeling across the country. One is that they talked about racially charged theme parties and incidents were happening at an unprecedented level, these diversity flashpoints that were happening. In some instances, these flashpoints were students who were doing different types of things that became public. In other instances, it was happening in the classroom, maybe faculty members who were perhaps using the N-word, teaching different classes. In other instances, it was racist or sexist or misogynistic or other types of posters that were being put up, postings that were happening, things that were going on as never before. We had individuals who talked about being fearful to teach their classes who were women and women of color at some institutions, and they talked about this consistently across a number of different conversations that we had. Alternative right dynamics shaking our campuses in ways that are very powerful and engaged. Free speech conversation and monument conversations. Everything is protected under free speech. The litmus of something being unprotected speech is so very high. And while you at public institutions have an ability to pivot and shut things down more aggressively than at public institutions, at the same time, academic freedom creates that same context. And these are dynamics that we're teasing with now as never before. Heightened feelings of exclusion for diverse groups, campus activism and protest at all-time highs. These constant dimensions of safety and demands and actions. When conservative speakers come to our campuses, running up the security bills into the $250,000, $300,000, $500,000 to host some of these conservative speakers who are coming with only one intention. Not to create inclusion dynamics, but to create ripple dynamics that allow for campuses to burn. Diversity crisis management versus proactive engagement. Responding to the crisis of the day versus proactively trying to build an agenda. And these impending policy challenges, whether we're talking about in terms of DACA, Title IX, race-conscious admissions, the Office of Civil Rights and strategic shifts, and so much more. across the board, all these dynamics are being felt, not just at Case Western Reserve University, but at Cleveland State, at Miami University, at Ohio University, at Ohio State University, at every other institution, not just in the Midwest, but across the entire ecosystem of the academy. These are the themes and others that we're facing and we're grappling with, trying to navigate. A resurgence of activism, though, as this generation is more and more engaged in many ways than prior. A consciousness and an engagement around these issues. The Never Again movement. The Black Lives Matter movement, which many have identified as a beginning point that launched kind of this new era. The Me Too movement, again, which is shaking the foundations of so many pillars of our society, toppling individuals who are iconic in so many ways, quickly and swiftly. The NFL and the diversity and inclusion business case. See, one of the things about working at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America is you had about 300 plus corporate accounts that you managed that capitalized at about $250 million. So at any given time, you're working with everybody. We oftentimes will work with the major sports franchises. The NFL had been a great partner, but had moved in some different directions, so weren't partnering at the national level, but we're doing things at the local level. I was sitting in my office right before I left Boys and Girls Clubs, a couple of weeks, phone rings. Doc, we got the NFL on line 1. You want to take the call? Yeah, I want to take the call. It's the Shield. Are you kidding me? Put them through. So we're on the phone with the NFL. And they wanted to come and wanted to have a conversation with us about a new partnership. We're like, wow, we've been trying to get them back to the table for years. This is fantastic. We'd love to have a conversation with you. And inside of their why was their business case for diversity. It was their business case for diversity, right? 50% of our population does not play football at the highest levels. Women. 80% of all household decisions are made by who? Women. What is the greatest concern that exists from a healthcare related perspective in football? Concussions. And youth sports and activity is down because those same individuals that don't play the sport, that make all the decisions, are not letting little John play football anymore. And so we see this happening. At the same time, on Sundays, we find ourselves not simply talking about what the great Tom Brady is going to do on the field or what the resurging Cleveland Browns are going to do on the field, right? Right? What magic is Baker going to do next, right? We're not just talking about that, but we are also spending our time talking about creating opportunities to express a freedom of idea and philosophy, but doing it in the most high profile of ways and allowing for another type of domination to rear its ugly head. And so for the first time, the NFL is seeing some slippage in those ratings. They're seeing some backlash against the national pastime. And so inside of that, when you have those challenges and you want to scale a massive initiative, you don't call Ghostbusters. You call the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. And that's what they did. But not just seeing those things play out in that way. How many of you saw this? Right? The racist, overt, exclusionary advertising campaign put out by the clothier H&M. Now, how did this happen in 2016, 2017, that such an advertisement could ever meet all of our consciousness when you got folks making hundreds of thousands of dollars and making decisions and working with multi-million-dollar advertising agencies to create the strategy? See, it happens when we don't create culturally engaged learning experiences in our curriculum and co-curriculum, helping students not just to be aware, but to have the ability to make culturally relevant decisions as a marketer, culturally relevant decisions as a healthcare provider, culturally relevant decisions when they're creating new design products, looking at the world from multiple perspectives, asking the question, how does this safety protocol and this seatbelt work not just for people who are male, but how does it work for individuals who are female? Asking questions that are culturally relevant in nature, whether it relates to policy, whether it relates to engineering and design, or it relates to culturally competent healthcare and different modalities of healthcare engagement when you look at treatment modalities in breast cancer. See, that work begins here. And when we don't do that work, then these are the types of advertisements that we get. Or even worse, what about this one? How did this one come to light? Putting forward a classic racialized trope that has been a part of the soap industry for generations, illustrating a black woman pulling back her black dirty skin to reveal the clean, pristine alabaster white skin of the woman whose skin was revealed next. How does this happen in the 21st century? It happens when we don't have general education diversity requirements. It happens when we don't have first-year experience programs. It happens when we don't engage this in terms of our grand rounds with healthcare providers. It happens when we don't help our MBA students to understand how to make culturally relevant decisions, not just to be getting some low-level awareness of bias, but how to make culturally relevant decisions when you have to analyze multiple different types of cultural data to understand, you know what? If we were to come out and put signs on all the Sam's Clubs, that is going to send a powerful ripple of exclusion when those working class, blue collar folks come to work that day. And the message that they got is you no longer have a job. No one looked at that through a dimension of culture and the culture of economics and being a working class person, a blue collar person who is engaging in the very much business of going to work every day. Or even you see some instances, they're trying to get it right? So Pepsi Cola, they have an insight that was driven by this particular advertisement, which was driven by the reality that we know that the millennials and the centennials are wanting to be connected to companies, organizations, and institutions that are purpose-driven and cause-aligned. They want that in many instances. And in this instance, Pepsi said, we're going to come out with an advertisement that's going to take a Black Lives Matter type of social disruption and hero Kendall Jenner as an influencer of this generation to come out with a Pepsi to resolve the conflict. Well, the backlash that came to that was powerful, and it was very profound across the board. At the time, I was meeting with Bernice King, the daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King, talking about how we could introduce principles of social justice and community to a new generation. And how we could do that work. So we're meeting with her at the 50-year commemoration of his slaying. And so a couple weeks later, this advertisement came up, and it led to Miss King putting the following tweet out into the social media landscape. And she tweeted as follows: "Oh my gosh, if only Daddy would have understood the power of a Pepsi, we would have been able to resolve the social justice and civil rights challenges so much faster." Tone-deaf advertisements, right? But those tone-deaf messagings happen when deans don't put the right message out after an instance happened, when presidents don't put the right messages out, when we stand in front of audiences as faculty members at large, or student affairs leaders at large, or we're in residence halls at large, and we're not engaging in that. And again, it goes back to the ABCs about affirming identity, building community, and cultivating our abilities as leaders. In this 24/7, 365 world of tribes, that there's no secrets. Too oftentimes we focus and we engage our work like the cheetah and not the wolf. The cheetah will sit high on the plain of the Serengeti, waiting for a diversity crisis moment to happen. And when that diversity crisis moment happens, that diversity flashpoint happens, they burst forward in a hurtling of energy. And they make the statements and they do the stuff. But then you look, is there a chief diversity officer that's engaging over time and over task, trying to build capacity? Is there a president who doesn't just make big statements, but can say is consistently engaged with the work? Are there spaces like this and diversity lecture series that are elevating these issues and conversations in an ongoing way? Are there power of 365 types initiatives that are happening, trying to not just create one-time moments in time, but an intensity for every first year, every faculty, every new person in this community, and later over time? See, because innovation is about those types of things. But innovation is also about begging the question, what's next? Because Steve Jobs never stopped innovating. Those who seek out the highest levels of impact never stop in their pursuit of. And so the challenge for you is just, how do you continue to build upon the great work that's happening to continue to double down and triple down and find new possibilities in ways that are not Cheetah-like? See, the Cheetah is very crisis-driven, isolated efforts, 100 things we do, a lack of coordination, a lack of point leadership, symbolic support, simple and mechanistic, small focus. It's frenetic. I know y'all want to take a picture of that. Go ahead and get it. She right here. She was trying to get it. She was loading it up. Now, don't forget, I'm at DAW PhD, and we hashtagging strategic diversity, leadership, and inclusive excellence. But this idea of being cheetah-like in our approach versus being wolf-like. Now, the wolf can be found not just in one part of the world. The wolf can be found across many different environments. The wolf moves relentlessly, not for 300 meters. The wolf can move relentlessly for days at a time. Everybody playing a role trying to ensure the life and the sustenance and the success of the pack. See, it's not just about having a chief diversity officer. It's not even about just having a president who's committed. The question is, how do each and every one of us here today make a difference in the life of someone else, make a difference where we live, whether we are a faculty member, whether we are undergrad, whether we are a grad, whether you're a department chair, whether you are associate dean or a dean, whether you're a provost, whether you're a fundraiser, whether you're a communication specialist. How do you make a difference in this work today? Today. I went to a wonderful provost retreat this morning, and the theme of the retreat was putting the lead back in leadership. The rate limiting factors that we see is a lack of courage, and it's people not leading, engaging, trying to innovate and do things differently. Whether that innovation is as simple and as small as, you know what, I'm a sophomore and I study with the same people all the time, and I'm going to start a different type of study group in my classes. Or I'm going to look to partner in a different way. Or as a faculty member, I'm going to start off my class by having folks bring to the class an object that means something significant to every person. And we're going to spend the first 30 minutes talking about that object, because what I know is that when people talk about who they are and bring that to the environment, it starts to lessen social distance and it starts to increase empathy because you have a greater level of connection, and I can do that. That's what it's about. In addition to commitment and currency being allocated to move the agenda with strategic initiatives. But I wrote about all that in strategic diversity leadership. But we need wolf-like activity, strategic focus, connecting and synchronizing efforts, collaborative dynamics. We need vertical diversity structures and lateral diversity infrastructures. We need CDOs and diversity point leads and committees. We need units that are engaging this work. We need defined leaders who engage in the business of leadership, deans who lead, department chairs who lead, faculty who lead. Engage leaders at the senior-most level, because senior-most level leaders create the big context. They allow for certain things to manifest and emerge so that we can all be a part of it. Not just symbols, but materials of support, innovating and being creative, implementing things and trying to go big with them, and moving forward with discipline and relentlessness over time. Now, I have found that engaging in this type of work, it is incredibly difficult. Oftentimes, when I go to different institutions, I am confronted with the following statements. We are struggling with campus diversity. We have a diversity plan, but is it enough? How can we turn the corner? Where do we start? How can we make a difference? Can you tell us what to do? Can you help? Save us, Obi-Wan Williams. You're our only hope. I will oftentimes be confronted by this narrative when I visit different institutions. And the thing that I always say is that there's no magic pill to help us get towards inclusive excellence. That we would want for the work to look like the blue and the red and be a very steep change curve and initiative, but oftentimes it's very difficult, it's calcitrant, it's entrenched, and it takes a long time to move agendas forward. I like to talk about this idea of innovation. How many of you have seen this model, the diffusion of innovation? I talk about this idea of innovation quite a bit, but at times when we're trying to innovate, we spend all of our time thinking about the resistors, those who are in the tails, who are to the far end. But the reality is, when we introduce a new initiative or something, there's going to be a small group, 2.5% as the model articulates, that are innovators. They're going to go with it. There's going to be another group of early adopters, and for the most part, they're going to go with it too. Then on the other end, you got a group of resistors that are never going to buy into what you're talking about ever. And you got a group of laggards who are not going to buy in ever. The game is in the middle. It's the early majority and the late majority. And it's how you get those individuals involved in the work, involved in the discussion, such that we're not just here as innovators and early adopters in a conversation of the choir, but you're doing the work to get that early majority. They go with it, but the right person maybe has to ask them. They'll go with it, but what you're doing has to be very compelling and good, not just something. How many of you are familiar with the work of Seth Godin, spelled Godin? Seth is another very penetrating and powerful thinker of the 21st century, very influential in the connection economy, who wrote this book. He wrote several books, one titled Tribes, which is a New York Times bestseller, Permission Marketing, another one titled The Purple Cow. And one of the things that Seth talks about is that in a world of constant distraction, so many things coming at you, what do? You just delete, you ignore. And he says, what we have to do is to come up with ideas, products, experiences that we can't easily delete because they're remarkable. They're remarkable. And he talks about what it means for something to be remarkable. If you were driving down the street and you saw a cow, you say, oh, I'm just in Ohio, it's a cow. But if you were driving down the street and you saw a purple cow, you stop the car, you go over, you take a picture, you tweet it, you call somebody. When you saw the next person, I just saw a purple cow. It was purple all the way through. The cow was remarkable. Now, when we develop our diversity and inclusion professional development, training programs, initiatives, things that we're doing, are they purple or are they brown? When someone went through it, did they walk away and were talking about it in ways that they were communicating it to someone else, so now the idea is spreading? When ideas are purple, then they are something that individuals who are early adopters and innovators will then spread to the early majority, who can then spread to the late majority. Let me break this down in a way that everybody understands this model. Who in the room uses an iPhone? All right, we got some iPhone folks in the room. Now the iPhone, what was it? The iPhone 10 just came out. The iPhone X Power, Excalibur just came out. Whatever it is, right? The new iPhone just came out. Now, 2.5% of folks, they had sourced the iPhone from the factory that built it, got it early, downloaded the software, and started putting it in operation before it ever became publicly available. 13.5% of folks, as soon as Apple said it was coming out, they signed up online at Apple, they signed up online at Best Buy, and they had it and waited in the rain for the release date. Then there's the early majority. Those folks are sitting back like, yeah, I'm gonna get it once my contract is up. Right? They're waiting to get it once their contract is up. Then you got the late majority. The late majority is not going to go get it when their contract is up. The late majority is sitting back waiting for their phone to stop working because the operating system no longer works. Then they're going to go get it. Then you got the laggards whose phones aren't smart and don't have data. The laggards, their phones flip. And then you got the resistors, they don't even carry phones. The game is won in the middle in terms of being able to innovate. Because as we're trying to move change agendas forward in our institutions, we will feel at times like there's powerful forces of resistance, constraints that make our work so very difficult and challenged. And those constraints are because we're trying to move and evolve culture. See, just creating a new scholarship program is not moving and evolving culture. It's important. Doing things that are just these isolated things here and there are not moving and evolving culture. When we're moving and evolving culture, we're trying to make change happen at multiple levels of how cultures manifest themselves in our environment. For example, think about the pictures that are on the wall. Do those pictures send messages of inclusion and broad representation, or historical accuracy, but yet homogeneity? Not that we should necessarily take them down, but how do we bring other images into light that shifts the geospatial? Or are there cutaway ramps that allow for individuals to access buildings? Are there touch technology that allows for individuals who are otherly abled, whether you're talking about in terms of sight or you're talking about in terms of hearing? Are we creating culture in terms of how we build space to allow for spaces to become more inclusive? But at the next level down, we're talking about what are the myths, what are the traditions, what are the symbols of inclusion? What is a tradition of inclusion? See, you have this tradition of even these lecture series. That is a new tradition of inclusion that was created to create a countervailing, consistent narrative to create new ideas and new possibilities in this environment. The only thing I would have loved to seen is if every first year, somebody teaching first year class would have had all their classes here. And we were so on swole because 50 or 100 faculty members had signed their courses up to the Diversity and Inclusion Lecture Series, and we're activating something in a context of it so we'd be further amplifying the message of possibility here. But it's a new tradition. But at the next level down, it's about the behavioral patterns and the processes. And this is where it gets really difficult for us to move how we engage in the academy. We don't want to change how we do things. We want to be able to screen until our heart's content and then sit back and wish we had diverse faculty on campus. Screen until our heart's content, not search until we find those gems that are out there. I say all the time, LeBron James got recruited when he was up in Akron. Damon Williams, who was the first PhD African-American male in more than 25 years in my PhD department at the #1 department at the time, the University of Michigan, was not recruited when he was finishing. And it's inside of that where we have this conundrum. But at the core of culture, it's just like a piece of fruit. At the outermost rim of culture, it's very easy to cut a piece of fruit, right? But at the core of culture, that pit of that plum, it's calcitrant. It's hard, it's difficult, just like the culture of our institutions are. And it's at that space where we have to create these dialogues, we have to create spaces of engagement to be able to truly crack through and move culture and not just create actions. And that is the heart of being able to innovate over time. Now, I do consider myself to be a Jedi, powerful and wise in the ways of the Force, developed in my leadership by the wonderful Jedi Sam Jackson. And in preparation for today's remarks, this residency both today and tomorrow, I consulted with one of my most dear and trusted of mentors, someone who has guided me in my thinking and ability to manipulate the Force and engage in this business of change for so long, and that is the wisdom of Master Yoda. And Master Yoda said the following: strongest is the culture with this one. Colleges and universities are most resistant to change. Nebulous and multiple goals they have. Decentralized environments are prevalent. Shared governance, it confounds the greatest of leaders. Faculty and staff, they live long in the life of the campus. Conflicting ideas regarding diversity and excellence persist. Loosely coupled systems make the future difficult to see. Ritualistic and symbolic are their planning efforts, not focused on real change and deep transformation. Difficult be the process of transforming culture. Difficult be the process of implementing campus-wide diversity plans. Difficult be the process of achieving inclusive excellence. Strong you must be in your resolve. Proceed forward with caution. Thank you so much. So I believe we have some time for questions, and I'm going to pass this floating mic. What's your name? Thank you, Gabby. Gabby's going to assist with that. We've got a question right in the back center, a hand that's raised high. Let's go right there first.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. So how do you continue conversations with like the resistors or laggards in that model, or do you just try to ignore them and keep going?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a couple things I recommend. One is I always design programs, conversations, new initiatives, and I think about them. I think about what they might respond to. I think about what their critique might be. And I want to use the understanding of that to help me build a better product, build a better experience, build a better initiative, right? I will often even want to engage them in some levels of conversation. However, what I also know is that I'm not going to probably convince somebody that's that far into the tails. And while I would never say they don't matter, because that would be a flawed statement, what I do say is that I want to spend much more of my time working in the middle, where I have an ability to get those early majority and late majority folks engaged. And I think we spend way too much time worried about the folks that are never going to get it, never going to accept it, never going to believe in it. And we leave a lot of opportunity to get folks that are open to a possibility, but it takes having the right type of initiative and having it being really good, and who carries the message to get that person involved. Sometimes it can't be folks that are in the 2.5 and the 13.5. It takes folks that are in the early majority going to the late majority to pull them into the conversation. And so for me, yes, always be aware. Yes, have some engagement. Consider them in design. Don't allow them to freeze me. Spend way more of my time in the middle where I can move something successfully. More questions anywhere? Yes, right here.
In one of your models you have, you label it espoused values.
Yes.
Is there a work in that? My question was, the circle espouse values, beliefs. Is there a work in that? Is there, to me, it suggests that there's espouse values and real values that don't match up.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, the espouse values we get is, we support this, we believe in this, this is our values, this is where we're going. Those are the espousements. But at the core, it's the mental models and assumptions of what people really think, which actually becomes the real values, right? So for example, we value faculty diversity, but when we're in a competitive search process and you've got the diverse candidate there and the profile does not clone what you had already, that's when the rubber starts to meet the road of the espousement versus a mental model and assumption that says, you know what? I see great potential here. I see great possibility here. I really believe this diversity is going to add something significant to the department. They don't look exactly like others have in the profile, but I see the things I need to forge forward with. I think that's who we should hire. That's where the espousement meets the mental model and assumption in a decision point, and too often that becomes the hurdle, what we can't overcome. Yep. Yes.
Early on, you spoke about having a digital economy, and there have been studies that one of the issues with having the digital economy is that people tend to be disconnected. And one of the things that is coming across is how do we create more discourse on our campus and things so that we can bring some of that connection back between people and not just what I text, what I email.
Absolutely. So a couple things. One of the things that's happening upstream in the youth development space is there's a growing conversation around digital citizenship. And a part of that idea of digital citizenship is how do you engage in the digital world with civility? How do you understand the importance of engaging in a dialogue? And how do we move away from this brutalistic culture of just attacking one another in that space because we have faux anonymity? Right? So one part of it, I think, is how do we continue to elevate this idea of digital citizenship, even in the collegiate environment, as a part of something that we're doing as a part of the leadership narrative and leadership curriculum of developing 21st century Case Western graduates. So that's one thing. A second thing that I think becomes important as well is how do we create learning environments where we're using digital tools to actually engage in dialogue, right? I think that we have just scratched the surface of using different types of digital tools to create spaces for self-reflection, comment to self-reflection, and sharing and building. I think that faculty have got to be engaged in how they can level up and do that at a much higher level from a pedagogy and learning design perspective. And then the third thing is I think we also have to be coaching folks to understand when to turn the technology off and when to sit down and have a conversation, which has incredible power for not only helping folks to get better as leaders, but also in terms of mental and physical health. Your mental health services at this institution, probably like at others, is being overrun by new emergence of mental health challenges as never before. Those are being partially driven by the dopamine hit that is happening by the constant engagement in the social media-based world and landscape, which is having deleterious and maladaptive effects on the mental health of folks across the board, males and females, but particularly women. In the comparative context, we're seeing just an incredible growth of challenge in terms of depression. And a part of what some have started to connection of is this constantly, they over-index by over 40% more time in Snapchat and Instagram, which is a visualized platform. And comparison is the thief of joy and happiness and the sliding pathway to disparity and depression.
Thank you.
Yes.
So you might have actually already answered this, but I want to go ahead and ask anyways. So you mentioned with innovators are about collaboration.
Yes.
So we need to collaborate with each other. However, we are following into this idea of tribes, and we are becoming so driven to our passions, we're becoming more tribal. So we have a debate happening, but we need to collaborate. So how do we shift those conversations when somebody might wish to debate into a dialogue so that everybody is heard and respected in that space?
Yeah.
So that we can collaborate and so that we can innovate.
Sure. One of the techniques I like to use to get to more dialogue is to ask people to say more. So rather than responding, they say a point, say more. They say a point, say more. They say a point, further clarify. They say a point, say more, add to that. And what you're doing is most people don't have more than one or two moves that are truly engaging in debate. So one of the techniques that I use is I like to quiet my voice and go into total receiving mode. And I encourage them to give more and more and more and more and more. And then once they start falling down upon their ability to oftentimes push that pathway, I then start asking, how do we start pivoting it up to bigger conversation themes? That's just one technique that I like to use. Another thing that I oftentimes say as well is, how do we create ground rules for discussion before they happen? I mean, those are tried and true pedagogical methods and techniques that I think that we've gotten away from in some ways. But I think in this current context of very powerful, dissonant types of spaces, we need to bring some of those things back and make them more a common practice of how we're creating rules of engagement. Yes.
I'm standing because my Apple Watch told me to. I'd like to publicly thank my daughter, who is a college-age young woman, for dragging me into this whole discussion when she was about 13 or 14 years old, because it led to a brand new career. But one of the things that I got, and perhaps it's my cynical nature, but the story that you told about the NFL calling you made me question, is the one color that's most important in all of this work green? Is that... I mean, I'd like to think as a Gen Xer that we sort of laid the ground rules and the groundwork for a lot of what the millennials and centennials have built on.
Yeah.
But a lot of it seems to be that it finally got down to business.
Right.
Of people losing money,
Right.
of educational institutions losing money, of the NFL losing money.
Right.
So is this just a situation where we kind of have to be happy that the work is happening anyway? Or is that another dimension to it that we have to be aware of and wary of?
The thing I appreciate your point so very much. There has been a maturation of an economic imperative and a business imperative. I'm working with a number of institutions right now that have 40% underrepresented minority populations. I'm working with institutions right now that, because of the birth rate of white populations in certain communities and certain environments, they candidly forecast into the future, they can't meet their FTE levels of enrollment if they don't do more to embrace a broader spectrum of folks. When you look at 21st century purchasing decisions, those purchasing decisions and what is cool in this country is oftentimes dictated by underrepresented minority communities in urban centers, which shape cool for teens all across the country. And so there is a maturation of a business case, definitely in the corporate sector. And in higher ed, you're seeing more of it, although the institutions that are most responsive to it right now are those that have to be most responsive to market forces. Community colleges, public institutions, large state institutions. Private institutions have more market insularity, right? Because of endowments, because of the nature of who they source for their students. As a result, slower to embrace that. Right now, I'm doing a lot of work with community colleges because they know if they don't convert those folks into their learners, then they're not going to have the FTEs that they need to be a tuition-dependent organization. So definitely the business case have reached an all-time high, and it's going to do nothing but continue to accelerate moving forward. We are already majority minority in our K through 6 environment. Yes.
My job is to say...
To stop. No more questions.
That's it.
You all been great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Don't go anywhere. My job is to say thank you so much to Dr. Williams for coming and doing such a great job twice today, and he'll be engaging with another group tomorrow. We're so fortunate to have him on our campus. I also want to make sure you know that his book, which I have read, is actually, at least in my opinion, so far, the best book I've ever read on diversity in higher education. It is serious, it is thoughtful, it engages profound questions. It also contains a lot of really practical advice on how to get things done, and I just think it's a huge asset for all of us who are working in this area, and I was really excited to know that he was coming. And I have to say to everybody on our campus, all of you, but everybody who's not here too, that it is more important than ever to be talking about the issues that we're talking about today. This weekend, we witnessed yet another tragic event, this time at a Jewish synagogue right near us in Pittsburgh. This follows atrocities at an African-American church in Charleston and a gay nightclub in Orlando. We are also dealing with federal attempts to roll back transgender rights. We are dealing with the possibility of international students being limited on how long they can stay in the United States. Our students, of course, no longer guaranteed to stay as they used to be until their studies are finished. So all incredibly important questions. And I want to remind everybody that support services are here on our campus. We have a vigil organized by students for Pittsburgh's victims tonight at 7 o'clock. For those of you who want to attend, on the awning between the Tink and Freiberger Field. And again, I am proud of the way our community has come together, and so grateful to Dr. Williams for coming, bringing his significant research and his tremendous book. Much of the research you will see in his book. I asked him what he's working on next. I'm not going to tell you, but I can't wait to read it. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again, Dr. Williams. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.